Hey, thanks for sharing your source material with us today. We're going to dig into it now.
Yeah, it covers a really intense week in Los Angeles, focusing on events around, what was it, June 8th, 2025?
That's the one. A period your sources are calling a real flashpoint.
Seems like it, involving, immigration enforcement, civil unrest.
And a pretty significant federal response.
Definitely striking based on the description.
So our goal here in this deep dive is really just to work through the details you sent over.
Using only your sources.
Exactly. To help you understand what happened on the ground, the reactions, the bigger picture.
All strictly from that information provided.
We'll try to unpack those initial immigration operations.
How the protests then turned volatile.
Right. The federal actions, that National Guard deployment.
Yeah.
Which is key.
And the different political and legal takes on it all. Again, just based on the material you shared.
Okay, let's get into it. Your source really paints LA as being under a microscope that week.
It does. And it traces the start back to some pretty aggressive immigration enforcement actions.
Ordered by the Trump administration, according to the material.
Right. Over that weekend, it says ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, conducted coordinated raids, workplace raids.
Across several parts of LA County.
Mm.
And the source stresses these weren't, like, isolated things.
No, multiple spots. It mentions the Fashion District.
And industrial zones like Paramount, Compton.
Even public spaces like parking lots near big stores. Home Depot was mentioned.
It sounds like a pretty wide net they cast.
It does seem that way. The material suggests it led to somewhere between 44 and 118 arrests, people suspected of being undocumented.
And the source highlights that scale, that visibility. It immediately sparked a strong reaction.
And that's where things seem to have escalated. Fast.
Yeah, your sources say almost right after the raids, large protests erupted.
Especially in the neighborhoods most affected, often predominantly Latino communities where ICE was present.
And what the source really seems to zero in on is how quickly peaceful demonstrations, or what started as peaceful, became violent.
It describes clashes breaking out between protesters and federal officers. Places like Paramount, Compton again.
The details in your sources are pretty graphic. Demonstrators throwing things, rocks, bottles.
And even what the source calls incendiary devices.
And in response, federal agents using tear gas, flashbangs, pepper ball rounds. It sounds chaotic.
Reports of fires, too. Vehicle fires mentioned.
So this wasn't just contained, locally.
No, your sources make it clear this blew up nationally pretty fast, alarming civil rights groups, state officials in California.
And that alarm definitely got louder with the federal response detailed in your sources. This feels like a real turning point in the narrative provided.
100%. The material calls it a rare move by the administration invoking Title 10 of the U.S. Code.
Okay, Title 10. That's critical information from your source, right?
It is, because invoking it here let the federal government, federalize the California National Guard. Meaning, according to the source, they could deploy about 2,000 troops for immigration support and crowd control. Crucially, without needing the governor's okay.
Without Governor Newsom's consent. That detail, using Title 10 to bypass the state, your sources really emphasize that.
They do, and they specifically note this was the first time since the 1960s civil rights era. Title 10 was used quite like this, overriding a governor.
Wow. That comparison really puts it in perspective.
It does. Your source adds that these troops were positioned at major entry points to LA County.
Their job being described as what? Reinforcing raids and suppressing protests.
Essentially, yeah. And there's another layer of federal readiness mentioned.
Oh.
Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth apparently put active duty Marines at Camp Pendleton on high alert, just in case things got worse.
Okay, so given this level of federal military involvement and the described unrest, how did officials react, according to the material you shared?
Well, on the California side, Governor Newsom's reaction, as reported, was pretty sharp. Condemnation.
Calling it reckless and inflammatory.
Exactly, and predicting it would just make things worse, more chaotic.
And LA Mayor Karen Bass.
Your source says she made it clear that LAPD wasn't involved in the federal operations, wasn't coordinating, and she appealed for calm, for peaceful protest.
But the view from federal officials, based on your sources, sounds quite different.
Very different. They saw it as a breakdown of law and order.
And they blamed local leaders for not cooperating.
That's how the source presents their view. DHS, the Department of Homeland Security, even reportedly called the protests orchestrated acts of sabotage.
Strong language.
And the material even includes that social media post from Stephen Miller, the former White House aide.
The one saying, deport the invaders or surrender to insurrection.
That's the one. Just really underscores the deep divide described in your sources.
Oh, beyond the politics, what about the civil liberties angle? Your source brings that up too.
Absolutely. Immigrant rights groups, advocates, they heavily criticize the actions. The sources describe them calling the raids and the sort of military-style response racially targeted, possibly unconstitutional.
And there was a specific arrest mentioned. A union leader.
Yes, during a protest. Your source highlights that because it fueled fears, the federal actions weren't just about immigration.
But maybe aimed at suppressing dissent. Intimidating groups known to support immigrant communities.
That was the concern raised, according to the material.
Which brings us to the legal side of things.
Yeah.
Your sources mention experts questioning the Title X use here.
Yeah, arguing it sets a concerning precedent.
Bypassing state approval for troop deployment.
Yeah.
It raises big constitutional questions.
And according to your sources, it sparked talk of lawsuits, legal challenges against the federal government's authority in this specific situation.
Okay, so let's try to pull these threads together. We have the raids, the protests escalating, this unprecedented federal deployment, the clashing reactions, the legal questions.
Right.
What's the bigger picture significance here, drawing only from the sources you provided?
Well, if we connect the dots based on the material, this LA situation looks like a really stark example of broader national tensions.
Around immigration policy, federal power versus state power, civil rights.
Exactly. The aggressive tactics described, the militarized response.
Yeah.
Your sources seem to suggest this points to a more confrontational, maybe more politicized approach, potentially a new phase.
And your sources wrap up by noting the unrest was ongoing, right? The potential for more escalation was high.
Yeah, many observers, based on the material, were watching closely. Was this a one-off or the start of something bigger?
Like a larger conflict between federal and state authority,
Uh-huh.
especially with the 2025 election cycle, presumably underway or approaching then?
It seems that way. It's clear from the material you shared that these events were incredibly tense and carried weight on multiple levels, highlighting some really complex power dynamics and divisions in society.
Okay, that was definitely a lot to unpack there. But your sources gave us a clear path through it.
We tracked it from those initial ICE raids in LA
Through the protests turning violent.
and into that really notable federal response using Title X, deploying the Guard without the governor's okay.
And we touched on those sharply different reactions from officials, local and federal, as presented in the material.
Plus, the serious civil liberties and legal worries raised by groups and experts, all straight from your info.
Yeah, the source material you brought for this deep dive really does lay bare those tensions, doesn't it? Federal authority, state autonomy, civil rights, all clashing over immigration enforcement.
It certainly paints that picture, and maybe as we finish up thinking about that detail from your source, using Title X that way, for the first time since the 1960 civil rights movement, overriding a governor.
Yeah.
It leaves you with a pretty potent question, doesn't it?
Yeah.
What might that specific tactic suggest about, potential strategies for handling internal conflict or dissent down the road?
That is a critical question right out of the history your source noted. Thank you again for bringing this really important topic and sharing your material with us for this deep dive. It's been quite eye-opening.